What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Pro V Pro Tour Championship Week, but it's going to be a pretty quick show. We're going to get into course fit for East Lake. Of course, Justin played here in the USAM, so get some inside information there. We'll go through our DFS plays, talk a little bit about Castle Pines, pretty awesome golf course. And then maybe we even get to touch on some NFL stuff, but going to be a quick show. So Justin, you got to be excited having played this course before.
Yeah, it's always a fun week. I don't think I valued playing in a USAM as much as I do now back then, right? A 19-year-old kid and didn't know any better and just thought it was going to be something you did all the time. The place is really cool, full of it's got a bunch of legacy and I'm not a huge fan of the layout and the golf course itself. Back then it was all carry distance, soft Zoysia fairways. So not the best fit for me. They definitely made the golf course better when they put in Bermuda greens a few years ago. That being said, it's, for a guy like me, I feel like I just wore out the grooves in my 6 and 7 iron. So
it's interesting you say that because the course fit model does tell a bit of a different story. So it could just be because it's not amateurs playing the golf course. It's the guys on tour who all kind of have that carry distance, or it could just be the changes in the golf course. But regardless, we see about a 45% decrease in the predictive value of distance here in favor of 35% up on driving accuracy. And accuracy is actually the only skill set that is more predictive this week than usual. Approach play slightly down, and then around the green play is way down, 75% less predictive than usual. Putting pretty neutral. So we do have a chance for some course fit specialists, guys who are accurate off the tee, guys who will benefit from the lack of signal in around the green play. Both of those things kind of sound like we are describing Victor Hovland, so no shock that he won a year ago. But yeah, anything else really come to the forefront in your mind with that course fit model explanation?
Yeah, I mean, I like I said, I'm going to be a big believer in carry distance. But that being said, when I played there too, I'm not even sure that the Pro V was out. And we were using a driver that I think is probably older than you are, Titleist 975J or something. So it's I think it's a different area.
I think maybe the approach then is to look at the expected strokes gain projections, look at the GPP scores and say, you know what, this guy projects well. And if carry distance is more predictive than the course fit model suggests, then that's even better for the guy. But I'm certainly not going to go to guys with carry just for the sake of getting that carry distance. But I think the next step is, why don't we talk a little bit about the pricing, because the pricing is super different this week than last week. Only 20 fewer guys in the field, but now instead of it being really, really top heavy where we had so many guys over $9,000, we only get 7 over 9,000 guys who were, comfortably in the 9,000s, like Sam Burns, like Wyndham Clark this week, 8,500, 8,100. Hovland is all the way down to $8,300. Then we have a more robust $7,000 range, and then some really, really solid golfers, because they have to be in the $6,000 range, where Aaron Rye is 6,400. He's been one of the chalkiest guys for the last few weeks, even when he's in the 8,000s or the 10,000s in some weaker fields. So very interesting pricing. It's going to be very easy, I think, for people to use either Schauffele or Scheffler, maybe even both. So I would expect huge ownership numbers on those two guys. Don't have ownership up yet. We will, of course, this evening. It's Tuesday here as we record this. So all the normal in that regard. But what are your first takeaways from this pricing and how easy it's going to be to build lineups?
The first thing that stood out to me, when I just opened it, is I know it's staggered start, and so you get your finishing position and stuff, is I look at the guy most likely to win, even though he's not starting necessarily at the top, and then compared to their price. I mean, Rory McIlroy immediately just stood out as thinking, maybe after not playing very well for a couple of weeks, of a guy that is kind of foolproof, does the things that I think are necessary to win here. So that was the first thing that I really saw is I felt like he was underpriced, and that's where I was going to kind of go first.
That's actually a really good point to touch on. Is it does look like DraftKings is going to give finish position bonus points for the tournament itself, in terms of with the head starts included. So they're not going to separate the actual tour championship results from just who had the best score over the 4 days. It's going to be if you finish first place because you started at 10 under and you beat the guy who started even though he was 8 shots better than you that week, that you still get those finish position bonus points. So very important point. But in our projections, the win odds, the top 5 odds, all that's just about how they actually do this week. So we're not factoring in those in the projections themselves. That's something we have to do ourselves. Just have to kind of look at it and judge that way. The reason we did that is because it's so hard to separate, the DraftKings points from your finish on the leaderboard. And when you get a golf course like this that has a bunch of birdies but also has a number of bogeys, the DraftKings points that a guy gets it's going to tell the story of how they played this week more than it's going to tell the story of what finish position bonus points they get. The only outlier there is the guy who gets the 31st place points and maybe the guy who gets the 22nd place points. But beyond that, it's pretty much just how well you play this week. So we left the projections that way.
Yeah, I mean, it just goes back to this format of like, what are we doing here? I do think there needs to be a playoff, and I don't think that it should be just Scheffler versus Schauffele, although that probably would be the best two. Yeah. Should just have a 36-hole match play and call it a day. It's just they've earned it this year. I will say it seems to me that DraftKings has really taken into account the finishing positions with their pricing. Keegan Bradley is the first one that stood out. He doesn't need to be 8,700. The only reason he is because where he is.
Yep, completely agree. I don't want to get too much into our preferences for players this week because I think ownership, when you get into a field like this, ownership just becomes so clearly like the number one most important thing for a lot of these guys. So I will run through who projects the best. Morikawa, Hovland, Fleetwood, Henley, a little bit Horschel, and then all the way down to Aaron Rai. Those are the guys who just stand out as good values, but won't be using them if everyone agrees that they're good values and they're all super, super high owned. So don't want to touch too much on that, but I will say, without question, the best course fit specialist, the guy who projects the best here compared to where he would ordinarily, as I mentioned earlier, is Viktor Hovland. He is second in our expected driving accuracy, only behind Scotty Scheffler, and he is far and away the worst around the green, so it just makes sense that he's going to be the course fit specialist. The guy who is probably the opposite of Hovland, the guy who gets penalized by this course fit the most, is Tony Finau. He has the worst expected driving accuracy, really hasn't been driving the ball as well as we're accustomed to seeing from Tony, and is one of the better short game players. So down on Tony, way up on Hovland. But again, if ownership reflects that, we might even be leaning against the course fit. So all that being said, Justin, why don't you give 2 or 3 names that really stand out to you that you hope are going to be low owned, that you're excited to play this week, and then we can kind of just have some fun and talk about what we would do if we were in control of the playoffs and Tour Championship.
The 2 names that stood out first for me because of the way that I remember that golf course. Obviously, Rory, as I already mentioned, I think that he is that I'm going to lean into Rory big time this week. And I'd like to get him started with Pendrith as long as Pendrith is low owned. He's a guy that we know can hit it far. And I know that this place doesn't, the course fit doesn't seem the same, but it's way more like a place like Craig Ranch visually than what it's basically a narrow version of Craig Ranch is what it really is in my book. Now, that being said, like even the couple of par 5s here, you can hit it on or around the green into 18. Well, I think they're playing the par 5 as 18. And then when we played the USAM there, we played 10 as a par 5 and like whatever the uphiller is, like 13 or 14 as a par 4. I know the Tour Championship the last couple of years, they've done it the other way around. But regardless, you can still get it around those greens in 2 shots.
Yeah.
Pretty much everybody. So you've got that side of it. It just reminds me a lot of where Pendrith won this year. So if I can get him low owned, I will literally start everyone.
Yeah, he's been awesome. And the other thing is he's such a good scorer, right? So that was a big takeaway last week, is that there were some guys low on the leaderboard like Max Homa, like Razorman, who we talked about as being quite a good scorer, who just absolutely blitzed their real life leaderboard finish position on the DraftKings leaderboard, and scoring became a huge part of it. The downside, though, was we were all over that narrative, and there were some outstanding scorers who didn't score as well, like Byung-Han An. So it just became really, really tough to predict, and that's part of the reason why I didn't have the best finish that I wanted in with those 4-4-4-4 tickets, but that was also mostly just because Robert McIntyre withdrew, which became a killer. Would have had a chance for a real sweat without that.
Yeah, I know. I remember that you were super high on McIntyre. I didn't know if he was in both your lineups or not, and I knew you were a big Keegan fan. So, and you generally are, just because of his huge upside, generally speaking. Yeah, kind of disappointing that the guy that you leaned in on the most WPs on a big week, but welcome to DFS, right? I mean, like, as mad as you want to get about it, it's just part of what we have to go through.
Yeah, and I mean, he wasn't playing well anyway, so it wasn't going to be a big finish for me, but I do think I would have pretty comfortably cashed without that withdrawal. But hey, that's just DFS. It happens. No big deal. We've got plenty of opportunities coming up still, including which should be a fantastic NFL season. We just debuted, by the way, DVOA adjusted fantasy points against. So everybody loves evaluating matchups in fantasy football by looking at, hey, this team has allowed this many fantasy points to tight ends or this many fantasy points to running backs. The problem with those metrics, especially early in the season, is that they don't account for the opponent. So maybe you're citing a stat like, hey, they've allowed the third most fantasy points to tight ends. Well, it's week 5, and that team has already played Mark Andrews and Travis Kelce, so of course they've allowed a lot of points. This metric is opponent adjusted. It's phenomenal. It's going to help fantasy football decisions. It's going to help DFS decisions. It's even going to help prop betting. So super excited to have that. Let's get back in to golf, and let's talk some playoff format. I want to hear your ideas because I actually have a pretty extensive idea for how I would run the playoffs, and I think it'd be a lot of fun.
So I think that it would be much better off if we could play more golf courses like last week's golf course that was so good and do it at with a high volatility golf course. I wish we had something like that. Speaks measures to how many good golf courses are out there that we don't use on the PGA Tour as often as we should. But anyway, I think that the playoffs are 1 week too long. In my opinion, I think that, we could go to 100 players in the third week and play a couple of rounds of stroke play, and then make that turn that into either a 16 player match play format to finish it off. Just seed everybody. It's kind of the same format that USAM uses and provides a lot of drama and is a lot of fun. So you just, play 2 rounds at East Lake. It may have to extend it a week, Wednesday, Thursday, or whatever, and then go straight to a match play format. Even whatever we had to do, maybe even go to 8, whatever made the most sense. And then, as far as time, I know it's the end of the season, but I also know a lot of these guys are taking a lot of time off, and you're playing for enough money that, they wouldn't mind playing an extra day for a little bit better format.
This conversation always comes to match play, and a lot of people don't like match play as a concept for the playoffs because in their mind, hey, the playoffs are supposed to be a culmination of the season. The season is not about match play. It's about stroke play. You should do it the same way there. But I'm in a complete agreement. It's got to be match play. And I'll borrow a point that Tambo made earlier this week. Tambo put out a big thread on what he thinks the playoffs should be. And I agree with a lot of it. And my biggest thing is that where I agree most with Tambo is that the playoffs are never going to matter a ton. They're never going to be even a fraction of what the majors are. They're never going to be what the Player of the Year award is, right? If you want a season-long race and award, that's where it is. That's like the regular season equivalent of, some other leagues that the FedEx Cup playoffs can sometimes try and bill itself as. But what you can get a meaningful outcome is, okay, we know who has been the best stroke play player. We know who's been the major player, but match play is its own thing. In addition to just what you would get at the end of the season, you also then get a bit of a preview, match play preview leading into the President's Cup or the Ryder Cup each year. So that aspect is fun. You get additional sample size from the best players in the world to help make decisions on who should be picked for the President's Cup and Ryder Cup. So I love that angle. But then finally, it's just, I think, a much more dramatic final few weeks of the season. So the only place I disagree with you, Justin, is I actually like the idea of having 3 weeks. week 1 of the playoffs for me would be a large field, probably 150 guys, something like that, maybe 120, where you're still using the FedEx Cup point system, just like they do in round 1 of the FedEx Cup playoffs right now. You'd have more points, but it's not like it just wipes away the regular season. But that one would be about getting down to, let's say, 64 guys. Then the second week of the playoffs is essentially what we do in or what they did in the WGC match play or the match play, the elevated event last year. You do group play for week 2. So maybe you have groups of 4, highest seeds, of course, have some kind of advantage, but you play a bunch of group play matches for the second week and you get 2 advance from each group. So then the final week is the final 32 match play for the Tour Championship. But I would then do one additional thing. The guy, I think, what is it, top 70 make the elevated events next year? Is it top 70 or top 50? You're muted, Justin.
Doesn't it vary? Doesn't it, like, isn't each elevated event a little bit different? I think they have different field sizes.
I'm not sure. I'm thinking it's 70, but regardless, it doesn't matter whether it's 50 or 70. The next 32 guys out. So whether that's 51 through 82 or 71 through 102, those 32 guys would play an additional match play tournament also at Eastlake for the Tour Championship, where the winner gets into the elevated events. So you get one more spot that everyone's competing for to get into the elevated events. This would do a couple things. Number one, it makes the quote unquote consolation match wouldn't actually be a consolation match because no one cares who gets 3rd or 4th in the match play tournament. Instead, the quote unquote consolation match that's basically only there so they have more golf to show on TV is now actually an extremely exciting match between, they could be crowd favorites. They could be relatively unknown names battling for that final spot in the elevated events, which I think would be really, really good drama. So that's what I would do if I were in control. And I just think it's a much better system.
Well, I think we're in agreement that there can't be much worse of a system than what they have now. But we also aren't the biggest fan of Monahan either. So with about any decision he makes, so it just fits right in. Mm-hmm. They have to do something. I think there's probably 100 of us, right, with different theories, and some make more sense than others. The bottom line is, I think you had the best point in talking about this is this isn't like an NFL team playing for the Super Bowl. This isn't a Major League Baseball team trying to win a World Series. Mm-hmm. That goes to the golfer trying to win the Masters, right, or the U.S. Open, or that's not. It's just we've got to stop comparing this to being a true. It's an individual sport. You're not gonna get the same thing out of it. We just have to find out what works best for golf and not necessarily. I mean, how many times have we seen teams like, for instance, the Rangers won 1 million road games last year to win the World Series? They weren't the best team all year, and they won. So what's the problem with a 16 seed knocking off a 1 seed in the first round of the playoffs? It just has to stop you looking at it the same way, because that's not the way it is. Yeah. Could you imagine if the 1 seed in football started with a 14-0 lead in the Super Bowl?
Exactly. And I get it, because the argument there is that, hey, golf is more volatile than football. The best team in the Super Bowl tends to win the Super Bowl, whereas if you just made it, Scheffler has we give Scheffler a 23.3% chance of winning if there was no head start. So obviously the best team in the Super Bowl has higher than a 50% chance of winning. Scheffler only has a 23% chance. And that 23% chance is just about the highest that we've seen in years. Most years, the favorite probably is around 10 to 15%. So I get the argument for the head start, but it's just so gimmicky. It doesn't feel real, and I don't think anybody likes it. So I think we're all in agreement. Something has to change. We would lean really into match play, but we're not in charge.
No, and it's unfortunate nobody with the brains in charge, but that's a different story. Chef was so good. By the way, I just saw Rory best 72 hole score is 14-1. I'm a big fan of that number. I think that he's that's without the whatever the strokes that you get, whatever you want to call the lead or the current leaderboard before you tee off.
Where is Henley in that market? Do you have that up? Because we have Henley at 5% to win without the strokes. So I'm just guessing that that's probably the one that we like the most in that market, just based on my expectations of where guys would be priced. But he also has been priced kind of shockingly high at times, so I'm not entirely sure. I can't seem to find that in the prop shop over at FTN Fantasy. We've got him in the prop shop. We have that he's 125-1 to actually win the Tour Championship, but obviously that accounts for the starting strokes.
80-1.
Okay, so that I like a lot. That I will be betting if I can find it myself.
Yeah, that's the same. Like, it's funny because I just don't see Henley as a good fit here. Like, just knowing of what I know of playing there and what it's like, he just doesn't seem. It also depends on how firm they get those greens. They can get those greens now. They're Bermuda with sub air. They can get them as hard as they want to get.
It really gets back to the idea that you immediately think of carry distance and the course fit model doesn't. So if you're right about that, then Henley becomes a much worse fit and not a great bet. If the course fit model is right and distance just isn't as predictive here as you might think, and it really is about accuracy off the tee, then Henley becomes, I think, a pretty phenomenal bet. But also, I think Henley is popping to some degree there because the difference between the best projected players and the guys kind of in the mid-tier who project pretty well is smaller than usual based on the fact that most of the weights in the course fit model this week are below the standard. So negative 45% on distance, negative 14 on approach, and negative 74 on around the green. So not the easiest week for betting, of course, but hopefully we get some nice paths to take advantage in DFS based on ownership. We will see what those look like. Any final words here on the Tour Championship before we jump out of here, Justin?
No, I just want to mention I did use all of the FTN stuff in my first fantasy draft last night. It turned out really good. McCaffrey, Jamar Chase on the same team just seemed. I don't know how that happened, but
that's amazing.
Not very smart people playing with us. I don't know why they let Chase go to the second, but it was. We'll see what happens, but I do think that the weekly help for DFS football and FTN is going to be really good if you want to dive down that rabbit hole. So everything I've seen so far has been really good, and it's not necessarily like everybody else's, which I think is a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all the rankings and cheat sheets you could possibly want for your fantasy drafts over at ftnfantasy.com. And then if you're watching the show, chances are you like DFS since we love DFS and talk about DFS so much, in which case you're going to want the GPP scores that have crushed all season in PGA. You're going to want the DVOA adjusted fantasy points against numbers, all of that at ftnfantasy.com. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We will be back in a couple weeks. I think next week is off and then there's more golf to be played. So we'll see you then. Thanks for tuning in.